All right, I think we're ready to go. I think you'll need to put on your headphones to be able to hear. Everybody can hear me all right? We're good? All right. Appreciate it. This is all a very first for me to not hear all this through a speaker. And to be in person, you're all sufficiently far away. That's good. I don't feel so bad. Excellent. Well, thanks for coming to this session. We're going to talk about gaps in the data supply chain. And this is actually a study we commissioned, 451, the research company, to help us understand where organizations sit and how to address some challenges. Quickly about me, my name is Matt Vogt. I'm the Senior Director of Global Solution Architecture for Immuta Incorporated. We talk about data operations, especially in an access control manner. And so we were obviously very interested in the challenges people are facing in getting access to data. So if you like data, this is your session because this is data about data. So it's very content rich. This is again kind of a research project that we commissioned, and we're going to take a look at really a lot of the challenges that companies face when trying to get access to data in the hands of analysts and consumers. And some of the big challenges we saw. So a great number of respondents. We looked at large companies, predominantly over 1,000 employees, and really got some great findings, some great nuggets, some really surprising bits of information out of this, and some really common ones that you'll probably recognize and shake your head to. So really going to start with key findings. So we're kind of all about like the big, there's no big reveal at the end. So really the kind of the big three things. So there's this dichotomy between data consumers and data providers or producers. And really this is a problem with supply and demand. The number of consumers are just simply outnumbering by many factors the number of data suppliers, the people actually in charge of supplying the data. And so it's just really a supply and demand issue. And so three really kind of key findings out of that were this idea of security, this idea of a skills gap, and then even automation, right? So automation, and there's interplay between these, right? Between skills gaps and automation, and those kind of come through in the research as well. So this is probably the least, I could have put this up here like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but really starting with these basic statements is important because the statement's important, but the question about the why behind this is really important. So why is data more important? So really we've become more dependent on data over time. Think about the shift to digital over the last 18, 20 months of the pandemic. Brick and mortar retailers or retailers with both have shifted to an online presence only, new ways to interact with their consumers. Think about your different IoT devices, like who's got a wearable, right? So your house has a wearable, right? All these IoT devices, right? So we have more things generating more data, and so we need to capture that data. We need to understand how we can be more efficient in the market in communicating and interacting with our consumers, as well as from a competition perspective. So let's look at really kind of this growth rate of data. So again, the numbers again kind of speak for themselves, but this idea that the number of people consuming data, or the number of things, so either people or machines, is increasing. And so an overwhelming majority of people we surveyed said the vast growth in the data world in their organization is the people wanting and needing and consuming data, like by far. So there's this idea of kind of big data, but that's been around for a number of years. So if you've interacted with technology and data over the last 10, 15 years, you understand this idea of big data. But maybe as important is, or even more important, is this idea of good data. Now this is probably another conversation for another talk, but I think we're really entering the world of good or the right data rather than big data or all the data. So the data quality, data trustworthy are all impacting the ability for consumers or the data producers to get the data into the hands of data consumers. So these are kind of some big trends. Now let's talk about on the people side. And so we have this idea of a CDO. Do people here have a CDO, a Chief Data Officer in their organization? Yeah, so we're finding this kind of increase of this idea of a chief data officer. And the role in an organization really but it's a bit different depending on the size of the organization and where they report in an organization shifts, and we'll get into that raw data. But the idea of the CDO is becoming this bridge, to bridge the gap between the data providers and the data consumers and kind of shepherd data along. But it's not just a person in charge of BI and analytics, it's really a person that kind of sees the process of people getting value out of data. And that's everything from where does data come from, where do we stage it, how do we stage it, how do we govern it, how do we make it available, how do we protect the privacy of the data, and then kind of really seeing the value that a business is getting out of that data. So it's someone who should see kind of the end-to-end process of data availability in an organization. So it's not just about governance and compliance, it's about trustworthiness, it's consistency, the provisioning, and access. So what types of organizations have the CDO? So again, kind of this big rise of them. So about 60% of the organizations we surveyed have a CDO, but an interesting trend is not just that there are a lot of CDOs, but the larger the organization, the more likely to have a CDO. So again, we were focused on companies with about 1,000 employees or greater, but you can see almost a near linear line of the larger the company, the more likely they are to have a CDO. But there isn't a standard reporting structure for CDOs, which we kind of found interesting. The vast majority report directly to the CEO, but they could report down into technology, they could report into information security. We saw some CISOs getting reported into. Right, so it's not just, there isn't a standard way or a right way to have a CDO in an organization. All right, so now we're going to look at really this idea of that supply chain gap and some of the raw data, the raw numbers that people saw as their challenge. So kind of, again, this is kind of our founding thought, is there's an outstripping of pacing of the number of people wanting data and the number of people producing it or in charge of producing it. So data supplier, these are people in charge of ETL, they're in charge of protecting data, and these are your data engineers, etc. People consuming data, these are reporting, this is analytics, this is data science, anybody or any machine consuming data. Now, most people that we surveyed were really divided between the two. Like, I was either a data provider or a supplier, or I was a data consumer. There's actually a very small overlap between the two where someone said, I was in charge of both, or I oversaw both. So a really good mix then of insights to get from these two perspectives on this supply chain gap. So what was the breakdown? What was going wrong? Security, privacy, skills, and automation. Right? So these are the three main things that we saw come out of this data. Obviously, this is more than just a three-pronged problem, which we'll get into. I'll pull some other things out. But these are the main things that we saw the vast majority of respondents claim to most of the questions. So this last one, though, the lack of technology and process automation, Google calls this toil, right? This idea of just churning on data, the lack of the ability to put processes and automation around really anything. So into the data itself. Again, privacy, limiting access to data, and really this bears itself out in skills, complexity in the data, this not enough automation available. Now, the reason we kind of pulled that out, it might look like it was it's the fifth most important thing or sixth most important thing, but it was after skills, like it was essentially a virtual tie for second place. Now, kind of our hypothesis is that automation can really help lessen the importance or the reliance on this skills gap. Right? It can kind of compress the need for hard coding skills, or really needing to understand, where did the data come from, or understanding lineage. People, this idea of self-service of automation. So we found that to be that's kind of our hypothesis, but again, really important. So this is more kind of around people, process. It could include technology. We wanted to make the first question pretty broad about what you feel is this gap in supplying data. And the next question really kind of gets into specific technology problems contributing to the problem. So essentially tied for first place is scalability, but again, automation. From a technology perspective, number one, so tied for number one by far. And so let's dig into some more organizational stuff in that supply chain. So just like we said kind of earlier, this is not just a three-pronged problem. This is really death by 1,000 cuts, right? Where there's like cloud hesitancy, there's organization maturity levels of data operations practices, DevSecOps, etc. But then also, users using unsanctioned tools to use, modify, share, and change data. This idea of shadow IT. So one of the big things, I think, is this real-time access to data or stale data. So looking at this from a numbers perspective, people on the consumer side, so again, this question is very focused on analysts, data scientists, etc. They're really concerned with old data. And they don't want to make bad decisions based on old data. So this is a big problem that we saw. Think of the process that it takes to get information from your Salesforce, from your click-through data, from your Adobe Clickstream, all the way to a relational database in a data warehouse in Snowflake or in Databricks to do analytics on it. It's got to go through a process of ETL. It's got to go through cleansing. It has to go through your raw, your bronze, your silver, your gold table structure, and then it has to have the governance applied to it. Then it has to be released, right? So this can take weeks, right, to get data in the hands of analysts. So that's, again, kind of one problem we saw. The other is this proliferation of unsanctioned IT tools and people just putting data on a Dropbox. All right, so raise your hand if you have never used a tool not sanctioned by IT. Exactly, right? One liar in the room, okay? So we've all done this, right? So we have these tools that have been sanctioned by IT. Right? We have our BI tools. We have, we're a SharePoint, but a shop. So we have these tools, but now we want to there's a small scale project, or there's something that my tool doesn't do for us, and in order to get that tool, it can go through weeks, if not months, if not years of procurement to get access to these tools, which we think to do our job. So this is interesting. So we kind of look at not just the responses, but who are the responses coming from, right? And so this proliferation of these freemium tools or unsanctioned tools, the biggest offenders are leadership. And so the people who are supposed to lead by example, they're supposed to say, these are the tools, we've put a process in place for a myriad of reasons. The people who are most adherent to the rules are people who are actually tasked with consuming data on a day-to-day basis. It's their job. So speaking kind of those organizational dynamics, let's dig into that. This idea of data ops. And so this is more like a maturity life cycle, which I think goes into again, closing that gap between data supply and data consumers. So this is the number of respondents that feel like we're on a low maturity scale to a high maturity scale, and a very, very small segment of respondents actually said we're a mature organization in our data ops. But really about almost 60% said that there's no data ops in practice in our organization. Either it's really important, we're working on it, it's kind of for the most of the answers that we got. But it becomes really important to really weatherproof your organization against the gaps we've talked about earlier. So cloud migration, everyone, again, respondents here, anybody not have a cloud strategy? Yes, everyone has a cloud strategy. And so it really kind of broke down into four main segments. Are you cloud first, cloud forward? So cloud adoption is obviously very important. If you just look at the first two, right, you've got 70% of respondents saying such a cloud is where most of our data should be going, but there's still a lot of hesitancy. We can say we're going to go there, but not a lot of people are actually there. Not in this research study. There's actually another 451 study done about how much data an average organization is actually in the cloud. Like, we think it's this huge measure, but it's like 20%. On average of a company's data is still in the cloud, even though a number of companies have been cloud first or cloud only for a number of years. So there's still maybe some barriers to adoption to the cloud, or cloud hesitancy, or cloud critics, if you will. The top 4 reasons are all actually pretty lumped together in this data SecOps or data GovOps. That this idea of privacy, of control, of risk are all in those top 4. But what's really interesting about this, your eye probably hasn't even gotten to it, what has been number 1 over the past, 5 or 10 years, we even put this on the survey, that we actually gave all these options, but cost was on the survey. Like, look where it landed. Like, it's like a non-factor these days. Right? So it went from like the number 1 factor to almost not a factor. So people know the importance of cloud. They're almost willing to do it at no cost, but they're realizing it's actually not that easy. There are other things that are important to kind of crossing off the checklist in order to move data into the cloud. So regulation's an interesting one. So let's talk about that: security, compliance, governance. The organizations that were actually really advanced in having these types of controls that lessen the burden of putting data in the cloud were heavily regulated industries, which was a bit of a surprise, but when you dug into kind of why that is, like, they've been dealing with this for a long time, and the rules are pretty clear about how I need to treat data, how I need to protect data, how data needs to be controlled and accessed. So these big regulated industries and organizations, and this is kind of old hat for them. So they've had to develop mature data ops practices in order to move data in the cloud pretty early on. Whereas the unregulated organizations, a lot of times they don't know the rules. They don't know what data can go in the cloud, what shouldn't go in the cloud, what's regulated, what is private, what is sensitive, what are the risks. And so maybe there's just hesitancy just by not knowing what's possible. What can I do? So we're going to dig into a bit of then data strategy. How do we actually move forward in closing some of these gaps? And this slide is about as old as PowerPoint, right? It's this idea of people, process, and technology. This is nothing new. People influence the process. The idea is, hopefully, you should simplify your processes. Processes influences the technologies that you choose to move forward with implementing these strategies. Technologies, hopefully, implement the strategies. This goes back to unsanctioned tooling, right? Having to choose or feeling like you need to choose between using a sanctioned tool or unsanctioned tool goes to this process, this flow. All right, so some of our conclusions on this strategy of the data operations in the data supply chain. So data operations maturity, this becomes really important. So with this idea of automation and data ops maturity, you really lessen the reliance on this skills gap, right? So it takes out the major component to that supply chain issue. Now, technologies can reduce the burden of automation, which then goes towards that skills gap. So where actually, there's a slide actually I didn't spend a lot of time on, but this idea of data quality and trust. Right? This idea of trustworthy data, that's where we go from the era of big data to the era of the right data. The right data is the data you can trust and make decisions on. And again, so that's really kind of where Immuta comes into play. So our mission as a platform, as a company, is to help data teams build trusted data products. Like that's our whole mission in life. And our hypothesis is if we can help the data teams build trusted data and build that in an automated fashion, that can actually help close that gap. Right? And so kind of what we're thinking about from a strategy perspective, because we get to talk to data teams all day long, this is who we work with. So we get to ask them, like, what does good look like at the end of the day for you? And kind of these strategies come in around starting small, right? Getting a security model and an operations model around use cases. So not just like wholesale moving data to the cloud or moving into operationalizing it, but taking it use case by use case, right? Starting small. And then really take an assessment of where you're at today from an operations perspective, and know that if you don't have a mature data operations practice in place, you're not alone. And you saw like 70% of the respondents didn't feel like they had data operations in place at all. They're still defining it. So kind of take some solace in the fact that there's some company in your space. So that's, so we're happy to obviously talk with you about this, but we're really focused on this idea of cloud migration. Remove those barriers to cloud, by helping you understand you can apply privacy and governance and control on data on premises to help you move it to the cloud. And so really focused on removing the barriers to that. Automation around scale, again, helping to close that skills gap, but then really it's about building those trusted data products in the cloud. Allows you to launch data products faster into the hands of your consumers. So you can download the full report. It'll be online. You can go to our website and grab it. We're also around if you wanted to talk with us about it, dig into the details. Also around for any other questions. Thanks so much.